Good day, everyone. Welcome back. Again, I am your instructor, Sir Ivan Brian El Inductivo, and welcome to the statistics course. So last time we discussed about basic concepts and definitions in statistics, and we have learned about the concept of population and sampling, and from which we understood that the distinction between the two. This time, we will be embarking on a new lesson entitled Sampling Procedures. So, shall we? To start, of course, I will just want you to recall the concept of population and sampling we had, because this is vital in the understanding and how we will deal with the entire sampling procedure. So the concept of population is again the entire collection or entire element of what we wanted to study or analyze, while sample is a subset from the population, a portion from which we have selected or extracted from the population. So the process from which we try to select or let's say extract this sample is what we call the sampling or the sampling technique or the sampling procedure. And the identified number of samples from the population is what we refer to as the sample size. So if you're going to look at it in a figure, this diagram shows that the population is the entire body from which we wanted to understand or study. And because of the limitation of certain elements, we can only study a handful of these individuals from the population. And that is where we try to extract or select a number of respondents or participants or elements. And that is where sampling comes in. So we could arrive at a sample. So how are we going to do this? The usual learning objective is to be able to develop that skill on how to determine sample sizes and execute sampling techniques or procedures. It's useful for our research or in any study for that matter. So we will try to travel. Allow me to sojourn with you on how to do sampling techniques or sampling procedures. But this will not be a very didactic in terms of probability sampling and non-probability sampling, but instead, I want you to answer certain questions. And in answering these questions, we will arrive at the best sample technique or sampling procedure that is appropriate for your study or appropriate for the research that you're doing right now. Isn't that more efficient and more user friendly? Okay, so here are several of the questions, and let me start with the question: do I know how much is the entire population? When you have an idea of the extent and scope of the entire population, it will also be beneficial whether you're going to use certain techniques or sampling techniques on how and at the extent of how much you're going to gather as a sample. So if you said, yes, I know how much is my population, the entirety of which, then the next question you need to answer is, are my participants the entire population? Do you want to target the entire population as your participants of the study? Now, there are many considerations of this, maybe the, the size, the volume, the location, the access, okay, proximity, remoteness of the participants. But you need to decide on that matter. Are my participants the entire population? Now, let's take, for example, you said yes. Your entire population will be your sampling. Therefore, you don't really need to take a sample size because that will be the census or the total enumeration, or sometimes some books will try to attribute it or label it as universal sampling. But it defeats the purpose of the term universal sampling, where in fact you are already taking into consideration all of the elements. It's actually the literal population. So the sample size is not really different from the population. It means the statistic is also the parameter in this case. Okay. So if you have, let's say, I only have uh, 200 students in our school, and I wanted to interview or let's say survey all these 200 students, then do you really need to have a specific sampling technique? Now, you'll just be doing census or total enumeration of the population. Now, in this case, if let's say you said no from the original question of you're familiar with the entire population, then the next question will be, do I need to randomize the selection of participants? Or do I have a select purpose or criteria or condition in the selection of participants or respondents? Or simply, everybody has the chance to be selected. That's why we call it randomization. Every participant has an equal opportunity to be selected as participant of the study. That is when you call it randomized. So, what is your answer? Now, if you answered yes, that is the moment we will be dealing with probability sampling. So, probability sampling is the technique that uses randomization to make sure that every element of the population has an equal chance to be selected as part of the sample. Okay. But when you said, going back to this question, when you say, let's say, no, I have certain criteria or conditions in mind in the selection of my participants, then we will be opting to prefer to use non-probability sampling, or these are techniques that are more reliant on the perspective or the ability of the researcher to select elements or criteria or condition in the selection of your sample. Okay? Again, that's the distinction between uh, opting to use probability sampling and non-probability sampling. So let's continue with this trend. If you're choosing a criteria, a condition, you have something in mind when you wanted to select your participants. Now, the next question you need to answer is, I will just invite every available participants. I don't want to take a concrete sample, but instead, my criteria is whoever is, let's say, available, whoever is willing to participate, whoever is um, voluntarily accessible to contribute or participate in my study. Now, if your answer here is yes, then the type of non-probability sampling you will be using or doing will be what we call accidental or convenience sampling. It sounds familiar? Yes, this because this is the most common type of sampling being done in most of the market researches. In market research, most likely they will have least or no idea at all on the extent of the entire market or population. In this kind of sample, you will notice that samples are selected based on their availability, their accessibility, or even, as the word implies, convenience. The researcher will determine the limit or the point of, let's say, saturation or exhaustion, when to stop. For example, in a convenience store, you wanted to interview those buyers or clients that come in and purchase goods in a certain extent or time that you wanted to say this is already enough as my sampling or as my participants for the study. It is again the discretion of the researcher to dictate when that sampling is already enough or sufficient for his or her study. Again, if your purpose or your purpose is to select whichever is available, accessible to you, or simply convenient on your situation as participants of the study, you are using what we call accidental or convenience sampling. Okay? So going back to that question, when you say, no, I don't want to just simply invite who is available or accessible to me, and when you say no to that, then the next question is, the target participants are rare, And let's say I will just inquire who will be referred to me as eligible or qualified participant for the criteria I have set, or for the condition or the study that is, let's say, under the matter of the study that is fitting for them. So when you said, let's say, when you say rather yes, that I will just be looking at referrals from the word itself, you'll be using what we call the common term snowball sampling or the referral sampling. Referral sampling is a procedure used in situations where the population is completely, let's say, unknown, or there's scarcity of participants and only certain people have access to these persons or these participants who qualify for your study. So you'll just simply ask, uh, let's say, identify a first participant that is also familiar or acquainted or affiliated to the other qualified participants, and ask him or her to be recommend these participants to you, and of course seek their consent. So you will just look at the elements that fit for your study based on these people or these participants. This referral technique can go on like our market research. It's up to the researcher to know when to reach that saturation point. And of course, as the word implies, snowball, it's like simply passing or throwing a snowball to another to identify which is the next participant eligible for your study. So, for example, you wanted to interview or research on students that are, let's say, part of a theater or arts group when they were in previous years, and you don't have any idea who these people are that are involved in the arts or in theater. So you wanted to ask the first person you are familiar or you are acquainted that is affiliated to the arts, or simply a person of the arts, and then ask him who among the other students he know or she know that is also involved in arts. So then you will choose and invite them to be participants of the study, and so on and so forth. Okay. So going back to that situation, that when your targets are very rare or scarce and you have very specific criteria for or condition for this, then you'll be using again referral or snowball sampling. But if this is not the situation that you're looking at, and you have something in mind and said, I will just simply select participants based on certain criteria or conditions or purpose, or simply expertise of certain people that I need for my study. So if this is the situation you wanted to uh, choose, or let's say this situation fits your criteria or your condition, then you will be using what we call purposive or judgmental, or simply judgment sampling. Why purposive? Why judgment? Because the researcher has something in mind or criteria or certain conditions that must be met in the selection of the participant. So if this, let's say, technique or procedure is very much intentional, or let's say the purpose of the study is for this certain condition, and you only need participants that qualifies this condition, then this is the best sampling procedure for you. Only those elements, criteria, or conditions met will be selected from the population, which suits the best for the purpose of the study. So, for example, you wanted to interview, let's say, uh, school heads that have been, let's say, practicing their principalship for more than 5 years. Then there's a purpose of the purpose of the study is to select principals that has or have more than 5 years in service as principals. So those principals that doesn't have any, let's say, only has or have 1 to 4 years in service will not be qualified in the study. And that is a very specific condition and purpose of the study. So there's a judgment there. There's a criteria that you placed in order to select the target participant. Okay? So again, that's judgment or purposive sampling. Now, if your question does not fall on the previous questions and you said no on the previous questions that we already raised. Now your question, but you had something in mind that I just simply want to select participants based on certain limit or scope. I will, let's say, have a quota or a target segment of the population. I will just want to capture this population or this segment or this portion. Then the best form of sampling technique or technique itself will be quota sampling. So this type of sampling depends on preset, let's say, condition or standard, that it is not relative or might not be arbitrary or subjective to the researcher. It might be a condition set by the institution, limit set by the organization, or let's say by the panel or the advisor. It selects the representative sample from the population. Proportion of characteristics or traits should be the same as the population. So elements are selected until exact proportions or percentile of certain types. Let's say you only target 50% or 20% until it is already collected. So just to recap this, in the non-probability sampling techniques or procedure, it is usually the respondent's prerogative or the institution's preset standards or a condition that is already set that dictates the sampling technique and the sample size that you will be dealing with. So it is entirely non-randomized sampling. So there's already, let's say, a prejudice on which will be the target participants or elements or respondents of the study. Again, to recap, we have convenience sampling when participants are accessible and available. There is also what you call referral or snowball sampling if you wanted your participants to be recommended to you based on certain criteria and respondents are entirely scarce or rare. There's also what you call the um, purposive sampling. And purposive sampling will deal with your criteria, your condition, or your preset expertise or the experts that you wanted to select that is fit or appropriate for your study. And lastly, the fourth one will be the quota sampling. If there is certain quota or scope or let's say preset margin or simply percentage or number that your institution or your organization or panel or advisor has set for your study. So then this range of sampling is again under the veil of non-probability. Now we go back to discuss the second type of sampling, which is the probability sampling.